So I'd done something, I threw all the rest of the papers away, went upstairs into an empty office, and my heart was beating, and I made a phone call. And this Scottish woman on the other end answered, and she said, we went through basically this conversation. I said, I'm not a writer. And she said, well, you potentially are. I said, no, I'm not going to kid you. I said, I've just got this amazing story though. I said, I've left it alone for about 18 months. I said, and it's gradually starting to drip feed through me. I'm losing sleep, and it's just on my mind all the time. And I get the feeling that I need to give birth to this particular story. Like any artist, sometimes it just felt that it was ripe. Anyway, miraculously, she said, well, I'm not even down in Devon yet. I'm up in Scotland, and that advert actually shouldn't have gone out until next week, which again was another synchronistic, bizarre thing. And she said, I'll tell you what, I'm back in from Scotland next week. Let's meet up. And we met up the week after. I was meant to have a half an hour consultation for free. We stayed all afternoon, 4 or 5 hours. She loved the story. She loved where I was coming from. We started 1-2 sessions a week in between my other work. I started to cut my hours down. I really got into this writing.
So the newly motivated Bill then was prompted to begin writing full time. And as you said, a few years before though, you had been diagnosed as being chronically dyslexic. How did that sort of move you forward then?
Well, I think, I can remember I'd been with Katie for about 6 months, and we were doing, it was really frustrating because in 2-hour sessions of a week, I thought, this book's going to take me 10 years to write. And the whole writing process is going to take me 5 years to learn. And I know it sounds bizarre. I woke up one day, bearing in mind I've been in the construction industry for 20 odd years up to that point, and I woke up one day, and we all have this feeling where we just instinctively know that we have to do something. We have to go somewhere. We have to talk to someone. It's one of those that something had happened to me in the night, and I instinctively knew that I had to change my life, and it was as quick as that. And I can remember ringing Katie in the evening and saying, I'm giving my job in tomorrow. And I'm going to be concentrating on writing full time. And she said, well, what has your wife said? And I said, well, I haven't told her yet. And I was so fixated on doing this, and it felt such a pregnancy that I needed to get out there, that, I contacted my directors the next day. They called an emergency meeting. I said I was signing off as a director. I'm giving up the business. I'm selling it. I'm going to be selling my shares. And they're all in shock to begin with. They first of all thought I was, it was one big April 1st wind up. And I just I'd never ever to this day been more certain about something, and about this writing and getting this book Dying for a Change out there. And what I learned over that period when I was learning with Katie, I gave up this lifestyle, this 80-hour week, and all the stupid things that were going through it. And I think it was a point where if I wouldn't have changed my life, I think I would have had a mental breakdown anyway, with the stress of driving and the hours, the pressure of work. Companies we were going through a bit of a bad time, and big debts were mounting up, and I got to a point where I really needed a change, and it was just a breath of fresh air. I knew I had enough money for a couple of years, and I had a big payout with selling the shares, and I thought, I've got to do this. And although everyone else thought I was mad, apart from a couple of close friends that knew my story and knew to get it out, that I had to get this out. And then I just gradually, over the next couple of years, just sort of worked on this Dying for a Change book.
You've talked about the whole experience that prompted Dying for a Change to come about. But once you'd finished doing that, you began what was to become something of a major initiative, about 4 years, I believe, which was the Global Visionaries Project, in which you aimed to collect together the insights and wisdom from living everyday teachers and luminaries. So how did that come about? Where did the inspiration come from for that? And give us a bit of an insight into that.
Again, it's one of these bizarre things. I was starting to meet some incredible people, writers, and Katie was starting to open up a whole new world to me. I'd always wanted to write since a child, and it was one of these things that she started to put me in the arenas of different workshops and seminars and week-long retreats, and I was starting to meet all these great ex-writers from on the buses, all the comedies, the two Ronnies, and I remember sitting next to this guy one day. You know, we're casually there's 200 odd people at this week-long workshop, and I sort of casually said, you know, this guy asked, he's really interested in me, an older guy, and he said, oh, have you written anything yet? I said, no, I'm writing something, and it's going to really sort of get out there, and hopefully it's going to be good. And I said to him just casually, oh, have you written anything? And he went, yeah, I've written this small book, and it became very successful. That was my main my main sort of book several years ago. He said, I've not, nothing's happened since. Anyway, it turned out this guy was Richard Adams, the guy who wrote Watership Down. And, there's a guy who sold millions and millions of books around the world. Anyway, that for me was an inspiration, because he was so humble and so accepting of the art and able to help others, particularly new fledgling writers like me. Even at that stage, you don't call yourself or think of yourself as a writer. But that started to make me think about all these inspirational people out there. And over the process of that long week, I then started to email. What I wanted to basically do is, I just felt that this shift was coming. Even we're talking about early 2001, 2002. And I just had a gut feeling, like a lot of people probably back then, that society couldn't continue to carry on the way it was, that we're bumping up against limits with the environment, resources, the money situation, the land, the way price of property was going up. Like a lot of us, we had all a gut feeling that things couldn't continue as good as they were, that there had to be some big bounce back. And so I started to have this really big interest in all the world's big environmentalists and ecologists and teachers and visionaries and people that are at the forefront of change, who were looking at a new world that was coming through, where people were trying to gauge more meaning and more sort of life from their everyday existence. So I set about contacting hundreds and hundreds of these people like Jonathan Porritt and Jane Goodall, and these amazing writers and luminaries, change makers in every field, teaching, and so I gradually started pulling this project together and asking them basically what is their visions for the future. I have my ideas and my instincts about where we're going as a society, and it wasn't a good place if we carried on, and there was going to be this massive big quantum shift starting to develop in the next couple of decades. So I sort of decided that, well, why don't I start inviting these people? And I thought I'll keep it very short, almost like a Twitter for visionaries, and I asked them for 100 words. And that's how I sort of started to put the project together, by asking them what they're encompassing, their vision and hopes of where they thought we were going in the future.
So you've approached all these hundreds of writers or visionaries or luminaries or however, these various people. How did you then reach the decision as to which of the contributions you were going to include in the book?
I think what I wanted to do, I depended on where over this 4-year project, which I called the Global Visionaries, what I decided was that I think a lot of books, they're either spiritual books or they're environmental books or they're new science books or quantum physics books. And so often, I started to spend quite a bit of time in Europe, quite a bit of time in America, particularly California. And what I started to realise is that all of these pioneers at the coalface of change often never overlapped with each other. So you would find someone who's very deeply spiritual, and yet they had no involvement or interest in reading about the environment, or a quantum physicist. Quantum physics, as we know, the last few years with the whole the Bleep film, and with the new science and new consciousness studies that are going on now, quantum physics and the power of thought has really started to come up the last few years. So what I wanted to do is fuse all of these together so that somebody could pick up a book with insights from across the spectrum. Very few books that are detailing, or if they do detail the wisdom, it tends to be from someone like Emerson or someone who's 50 years ago, 100 years ago. What I wanted to get is very contemporary vision, hopes and experiences from people who are all living today. And they only had 100 words to do it. And, it paralysed some of them. Some of the great spiritual teachers of our time, particularly many of the Hay House authors and a lot of the authors over in America, they were petrified. 100 words, what could they say in 100 words? But once they got into it and realised that actually you can say a lot in 100 words. When you think some of the great expressions of our time, Mahatma Gandhi, what was it, 10 words, be the change that you want to...
That's right, yeah.
So actually in 100 words you could say quite a lot.
But there again, how did you actually narrow them down? What was the selection process, the criteria that actually got them into the book?
I mean, in all, there was about 500 that I actually got, and what I had to do is to get obviously a good balance between male and female, get a good balance around the world, get a good balance between ecologists, environmentalists, and what helped me to narrow it down was if I showed other groups of friends these vision statements. I was very particular about not putting it out in the marketplace or putting it on the net. But what I do, and what we did is like a litmus test, and basically if you read something and it resonated with you on some level, and I call it like the body barometer. If I felt it in my gut, my heart, on the hairs on the back of my neck, and somebody else said the same, that for me was the barometer that here was an insight and a piece of ancient knowledge or vision that really spoke to people. I used the body, really, basically. That was the way I decided.
Collectively then, what gifts and lessons do you feel they best shared with you that have shown us where society is heading in the decades to come?
I mean, incredibly, when I set off the project nearly 5 years ago, what I thought was going to be an amazing, creative, inspirational, uplifting project at times became the most depressing, haunting, petrifying experience, because what was starting to happen for me and what I was starting to discover is how precarious this life system is now, and how we're bumping up against these resource limits. And talking to some of the world's top climate scientists, and the changes that are going on, and contrary to what a lot of people say about cycles and taking all that into consideration, the way the planet is warming up, and what I learned from these ecologists and nature sort of studiers is that we really are heading towards this brink that if we don't pull it back quickly, we really are in trouble. And that scared me. What should have been an inspirational project scared me, because I started to realise that the next big resource of tomorrow is water. The water, the quality drinking water that is going to be available. And when people start talking about population, and only 100 years ago we were on barely 2 billion people, and now we're nearly on 7. 2010. Well, another 40 years and we'll be 9 billion. Well, we're massively over the capacity of the earth. We're bumping up against limits that are really over our capacity, and I think that all of these things taken into consideration frighten the hell out of me. And I think what I had to try and do with the book is still make it inspiring by getting these people that a lot of these people in the book have spent their lives, they've spent 40, 50, 60 years of their life on a particular speciality and an area and a sector of, and it might be the climate, it might be water shortages, but combined it gives us great. What 100 Words book gives is a brilliant tapestry of where we are, where we're going, and the insights that these people gave me all basically led to the same answers about that we're going through this massive shift, that we can all be change makers, and it's time for us to step up. The overall message from a lot of them is that we can all contribute. No matter how small these contributions are, we can all make a difference. And it might be starting up a small project in our local community for old age pensioners. It might be writing a blog. It might be collecting rubbish for a voluntary organisation once a month. What came out of it is that we don't have to be the massive big change maker, that we can all do small little things, and by each doing them we all make and contribute. And that's the inspiring thing that came out of it.
Mm-hmm.